Hello, I'm Coca Cleora, Director of Operations at Dimension Sciences. I'm here today speaking with Dr. Santiago Correa, incoming Assistant Professor of Biomedical Engineering at Columbia University in New York. Dr. Correa develops biomaterials composed of nanoscale building blocks, which are used to reprogram the body's immune system to fight cancer, autoimmune disease, and infection. Welcome, Dr. Correa.
Thanks, Coca. It's great to be here.
Why don't we get started by you telling me a little bit more about your work?
Sort of bring together the fields of materials science and immunology, where we're looking to construct essentially tissue scaffolds or injectable sort of bulk materials. So you can think of these as gels that you can administer directly into particular tissues because they'll become fluid-like during the injection and then resolidify as soon as they're deposited in the tissue of interest. And we're engineering those materials so that they can essentially communicate with immunological cells in a way that these cells are used to seeing. I'm talking about sort of presenting particular signals in particular, with a particular timing and a particular spatial presentation needed in order to, for example, mount a stimulus against cancer for cancer immunotherapy, or to shut down parts of the immune system to combat autoimmune disease.
How did you find out about this area and how did you get started?
Actually, sort of became drawn to biomedical engineering because I was listening to a podcast when I was a high schooler, and I was trying to think about what I wanted to major in college. And I found a podcast, and this was back when podcasts were really just for iPods. And I found a set of talks from professors at Yale, where I was planning to go to college, talking about sort of this new frontline developments in drug delivery and tissue regeneration. It really captured my interest. And when I went to college, I was really drawn, there's a couple professors at Yale who do this kind of immunological engineering research. And it was always something I had in the back of my mind, even as I became more and more interested in research and ultimately decided to go and pursue my PhD. And so in my PhD, I actually worked in sort of more traditional drug delivery applications. So this is where we were using nanotechnology to deliver drugs in very specific ways to cancer. And throughout the entire time that I was working on my PhD, I was kind of struck by the fact that, we're engineering these nanoparticles. They're essentially these artificial little viruses, and we're trying to make them go to cancer cells. And one of the big problems and challenges in the field has historically been that these nanoparticles get taken up really quickly by the immune system and by organs that filter your blood for things precisely in that size range, because our body has developed these incredible defense mechanisms against viruses and other similar pathogens. And, for many, many years, the field of nanoparticle drug delivery or nanomedicine really kind of fought against this sort of natural trafficking of these materials to the immune system. And so as I, learned more about this field and became an expert in it and ultimately pursued my postdoctoral research, I started to really think about, well, how can we take advantage of the fact that these materials do accumulate in immunological tissues? How can we use them in terms of actually engineering and changing what immune cells do? And that has become increasingly more important as some of the more traditional biotechnology fields have been demonstrating incredible capabilities for the immune system to fight cancer.
So when you were a child, were you already a scientist?
I was a lot of things when I was a child. I was really drawn in a lot of different directions. I was really interested in art, especially drawing and dry media. I think I remember actually being in elementary school, and I think a lot of elementary schoolers do this, where they have students illustrate and write a book, and then they bind it, and then you get to take it home. I remember thinking that was very, very cool, and for a while thinking that I wanted to be a writer. Then becoming interested in things like programming, and ultimately kind of coming back to sort of this idea and concept of medicine as sort of a driving principle. But it wasn't until much later, after I went to college, that I realized that my interest in medicine kind of went beyond sort of working with patients and went more deeply into sort of the research that sort of is a foundation of modern medical practice.
So tell me a little bit about your journey, say from what you thought you were going to go into from high school, and then what you started studying in college, and what your academic journey looked like from there.
I went into college really thinking I was a pre-med student, that I was going to go to medical school and become a doctor, an MD doctor, rather than the PhD version that I am today. So my family moved here from Colombia when I was very, very young, and so for most of my life, there's only one aunt that I had here in the States who also lived near where I grew up. The rest of my family was back in Colombia, and in many instances, if Colombian families, like many other Latin American families, are quite big, and so among my uncles and aunts, we had some medical doctors, and so whenever I would get sick or someone would get sick in the family, my parents would call up my uncle and just kind of like run everything by them before even us trying to go and see a doctor, because healthcare here is just so expensive. And I just remember just that being such a powerful sort of active service for our family, and that was a strong motivator for me to get into medicine. And so pre-med isn't a major, and so as I was planning to go to Yale, I had to think about, okay, what am I actually going to major in? And that's when one of my friends in high school sort of recommended I look into biomedical engineering. It was brought together a lot of things that I would find interesting, and that's essentially when I started looking at that podcast that I mentioned earlier that inspired me to be a biomedical engineering major initially in college. I have sort of an intersectional identity, being queer and also being from a Hispanic ethnicity. And so I remember when I got into Yale, there's a little bit of a backlash in my high school community. And there's some not so quiet rumors that I had only gotten in because I was Hispanic. This was probably one of the earliest times that I had come up and brushed against sort of discrimination in my life. And it was kind of surprising. I kind of got that from students, and I kind of got that sense from a couple teachers even. And so when I got to Yale, and it was a lot more challenging than the high school that I had attended, kind of an automatic thing that happens to a lot of people in that position is like you start thinking, okay, maybe these people were right, and maybe I shouldn't have made it here, and maybe I don't have what it takes to sort of cut it in that environment. Ultimately, I was able to sort of like really catch up to my peers after some time. It took some really sort of critical moments of mentorship and assistance from friends and faculty and also the Hispanic community at Yale. But at the same time, I was going through all that, I was also dealing with issues, regarding my own sort of sexuality. And I actually didn't come out when I was in college, which, a lot of people find kind of weird when I describe that, especially people who are familiar with sort of the culture at Yale, which is very queer friendly. But as I was navigating all these things, I kind of felt that I couldn't come out, especially for fear of sort of Hispanic families tend to be a bit more conservative socially. And so I felt in lots of different ways that I couldn't make that decision. And so that was manifesting altogether in interesting ways as I was starting to become more involved in research. I actually ended up doing a summer of research after my freshman year, not at Yale, because I, not sort of being plugged into sort of these high resource environments, didn't really know that I should be taking advantage of resources at my institution. Instead, we kind of networked with some family friends, and they found me a place in Georgia Tech. So I came back home to Atlanta for the summer and did my research, my first ever research stint there at Georgia Tech. And that was an interesting experience. It was very invigorating. It was the first time I had been in a situation where I was learning in that way and researching alongside a grad student and seeing what that's like. I was this intern coming from Yale, and people had these expectations of what I should know. And I didn't know anything because I had never done research before. And I remember having this mortifying moment where my grad students had asked me to do some background literature research on a problem that we were facing. And I found this really, really useful article. And it was my first time actually ever finding a PhD dissertation. I didn't understand why this article was so much longer than every other article I had seen. And I didn't understand why it had this, introductory segment that described it as a doctorate in philosophy, right? I was like, so I came to my grad student, I was like, I found this, it seems really relevant. I don't understand why a philosophy department would be doing this. And he like looked at it, and we were in the office of this lab, and he was like, oh no, that's what a PhD means. It's a doctor in philosophy. It would have been great if that had ended there, but another grad student kind of seized on it and was just really just like humiliated me in front of all these other people in the group. That was just one of these like moments where I think my life could have really gone one way or the other. I kind of brushed it off at the time. And it didn't deter me from continuing to pursue research. And I ultimately did find a lab at Yale, which was a really great environment to learn. It was very supportive. But it was like one of those moments where if I had maybe been having a harder day, or if I hadn't already been building up this capacity of compartmentalizing aspects of my life, that could have totally derailed my career trajectory. But ultimately, after finally finding a home, like a research home that was supportive and allowed me to do interesting research, that's when I first started to realize that what was driving me intellectually was research. And I remember having a brief moment where I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll do an MD PhD. And I started describing this to friends, and I am very thankful to a lot of really good friends, especially friends who are outside of science, that I had in college, who were like, oh, okay, so why? Why do you need both degrees? And I remember as I started trying to like come up with reasons to answer that question, I couldn't really justify why I felt I needed an MD portion, because I wasn't really being drawn or motivated to work directly with patients. And so that ultimately simplified my life quite a bit, because it meant that I was applying to graduate programs. And from there on, it was kind of, you sort of enter this track and things keep going in a direction. And that's sort of where I find myself now.
Was there one person in particular you can point to as sort of being that support that helped you continue?
For me, I would say it was never just one person, but there's a few people who are really quite critical. One of the first experiences I had, at Yale was, suddenly really struggling with classes. A lot of the sort of initial courses, especially that first semester of college, there's a lot of people, especially like the students who like went to the very, very nice prep schools. They came in and maybe this basically knew everything. They're like, oh, this is great. College is easier than high school. Meanwhile, I'm here drowning. For me, honestly, and not that many people say this, but for me, it was organic chemistry. I remember taking organic chemistry in sort of the second half of freshman year. And my professor, Alana Shepards, she really took this approach that was a little bit different from a lot of the other classes. So she really emphasized, this is about problem solving. This is not about memorizing. Like if you try and do organic chemistry and all you're doing is memorizing reactions, you're gonna, one, hate it, and two, you're probably not gonna do that well. And so she was all about mechanisms and understanding things on a very fundamental level. So that was a new way of thinking. And it was also suddenly a moment where a lot of the students I was with, even the ones who had gone to very, very fancy preparatory educations, they also didn't know organic chemistry, or at least they hadn't been taught to think about organic chemistry in that way. And so I remember that being this pivotal moment where I was like, okay, we're all starting from the same point now. And I really, really was able to thrive with that kind of philosophy. And when I did really, really well in that class, it was one of these sort of defining moments in my undergraduate career where I finally felt that I might actually, be cut out for science. Professor Shepards is, pretty remarkable. That was a massive class. I didn't necessarily interact with her very much one-on-one, but just her philosophy, her teaching was just instrumental for me, for my personal growth. Then, alongside sort of that faculty angle, I had really good friends who sort of became sort of like the people I'd take all my classes with, who really became sort of bedrock people to like be working with. I think, thinking back to that time and also thinking about students that I've mentored since then, I think the people who struggle the most in these situations is when you sort of isolate yourself and retreat from resources and support. And so fortunately I had these friends and they kept me, from doing something like that. And then at Yale, there was also La Casa Cultural, which was a cross-Hispanic affinity sort of umbrella organization. And there, had it was a nice connection to other people with Hispanic backgrounds. And two, they were really instrumental in putting together this supportive fellowship for folks from underserved or historically excluded backgrounds to support them getting into research. So, I mentioned that initially I went and I got a research internship outside of Yale that I sort of was able to make happen because my sister was friends with someone who's a professor in the econ department at Georgia Tech, who had a friend in the biomedical engineering department at Georgia Tech. It's very sort of like horse trading way of getting an internship. I did that because I didn't realize that we have all these resources. I had all these resources at my fingertips. I didn't know how to take advantage of them. And that fellowship, one of the main things was that it, one, paid you to do research as an undergrad, and two, took steps to actually connect you and get you into a lab, which I've found is actually a really critical sort of missing link for folks coming in from backgrounds where you are not necessarily aware of how to make it, how to take best advantage of opportunities that are laid out to you in some of these high resourced environments.
So you talked about not coming out while you were in undergrad. You were still figuring out things. You were still figuring out your identity. So what was that coming out process like when you did finally come out?
I remember in college, essentially, finally kind of coming to terms with my sexuality towards the end of my senior year. All along, I think one of the biggest issues for me, I think, and I had known probably like, and not been totally honest with myself earlier than that. But I remember just feeling like I couldn't come out because everyone already knew me in this way. And I almost felt like if I were to come out, then everyone would think that I was a liar for all of these years in college. For straight people, I think they hear them and maybe think that's kind of crazy or something. I don't know. But for me, it was a really big barrier. It was, feeling like I would somehow be letting down all these people who had become such close friends of mine over so many years. On top of that, I was very worried about how my family might react. I was still financially dependent on my family and felt that I would be in a very vulnerable place if my family reacted in a way that was very negative. And so those things combined, ultimately led to me kind of starting to come out to people, honestly, in the last month of college. And then when I moved to Boston to start grad school at MIT, that sort of reset of the environment I found so liberating, and I just came in and I was just like, this is who I am. And so I remember feeling, oh my gosh, at 21, this is what it's like to just be yourself. And I think that's one of the reasons why Boston, I think, is always going to hold a very special place in my heart. The kind of levity that I felt when I first moved there was, it's hard to describe. Maybe initially starting out my research career, being closeted from not just people at work, but everyone in my life. To starting my graduate program out and open, it was a big difference. I think in this past year there was this great paper that came out that looked at sort of differences in productivity in queer people in science, right? Depending on whether or not they were out at work, and they saw this enormous differential in productivity where people who were closeted at work were publishing far fewer papers across multiple metrics. And, you know, when I saw it, I was like, this makes sense to me. You know, I felt so much better not having to manage that anxiety all the time. That being said, I was out in Boston, in my life in Boston, but I wasn't out to my family until 4 years later. Parents decided they wanted to come to visit. And at that point, I had a long-term boyfriend who I spent all my time with. And I'm like, I couldn't imagine pretending in Boston, of all places where I felt like I had to find this liberty, pretending, even if it was for a weekend, that life didn't exist. And so that's ultimately what precipitated me coming out to my family, and ultimately, I guess, broadly coming out and completely in my whole life.
Have you found that your field is open to diversity?
The field of biomedical engineering, I think, is actually really kind of progressive in a lot of ways. I kind of attribute it often to the fact that we're probably one of the youngest engineering disciplines. And I think that we've been able to sidestep a lot of the sort of baggage that more historical departments kind of carry with them. So, you know, comparatively, I think BME and bioengineering is miles ahead of a lot of other areas of STEM in terms of diversity and inclusion and equity. I personally have not had any real sort of backlash or issues with either my ethnicity or my sexuality in my professional life thus far. You know, part of that was me, I think, being pretty intentional in seeking environments that I felt were going to be supportive and safe. You know, I think I did that to a certain extent when I looked at graduate schools. And it was definitely something that, you know, colored my search for postdoctoral positions and ultimately faculty positions. You know, I was actually, I did a panel not too long ago for queer researchers thinking about their career paths in research. And I think that that was what me and the panelists kind of like ultimately saw as one of the biggest influences is, you know, we queer researchers, I think, look at much more narrow areas and opportunities based on where we would feel safe and secure. So I think that that is sort of one of these things that, you know, like if you're able to, you know, stay in these spaces, that can work out really well, but I'm sure it leads to issues where people are like, okay, if my only option is in sort of an area of a country where I don't feel like I would be safe or supported, you know, I think that's where you see people opting out of some of the next steps in research careers. What
advice would you give to those students in pursuing a career in your field?
One of the most important things to be successful in research is to be able to find a way to balance the sort of inherently intrinsically difficult work that research is. It can be very stressful and very hard for so many different reasons. And in order to really face that, you need a foundation of sort of a good life, right? You need to be able to enjoy your life enough to be able to deal with some of the stressors from the career path that you're choosing. So for those of us from these intersectional backgrounds, or even, you know, even if it's not intersectional, even it's just one aspect of your identity that makes it difficult to find spaces where you can feel authentic and safe. That's really what you have to prioritize, though. So, you know, I would tell those students to, you know, put aside maybe questions of sort of this program is the best in my particular field, or, you know, this school is so fancy and prestigious. I really prioritize figuring out which of these environments will actually truly be supportive and be a place where you feel like you can build a very happy life. I've spoken to so many mentees from different backgrounds at MIT, and I was like, oh, talking to them, it's like, oh, so what draws you to MIT? And we're like, the name. I'm like, oh, is there anything else? It's like, no, not really. I actually hate Boston. I think I'm not going to enjoy living here. And I tell them, it's like, well, you're starting off on the wrong foot. Like, this is a really like challenging process to obtain a PhD and to enter into this kind of high level of research. If you are not going to be happy when you go back home at the end of the day because you don't like the place that you're living, or because you don't have a community of friends and colleagues, choosing an environment that's going to be very difficult for you to succeed in. That applies to everyone doing a PhD, but even more so to people from these kinds of backgrounds. And for those of us who are coming from those backgrounds, there's a little bit of additional homework that you can do. I think a lot of people think about doing a PhD program like they think about undergrad, and so you're applying to a school. You're not really applying to a school. You're not even just applying to a department. And there's huge cultural differences between departments and an individual school, and those are important. But the bigger thing that's important is the cultural environment of the individual lab and unit within the department that you'll work in. So, it's critical to the extent that you can to identify which of those labs, whether that's when you're doing your homework on the institution or when you're there interviewing, figuring out what the environment is in that specific lab, what the mentor for that lab, what their reputation is, like what their students think of them, and making a decision based on that. Secondly, I always recommend people make friends outside of STEM. It makes a big difference to have some friends who are not doing a bunch of PCR experiments or transformations or whatever flow cytometry experiments that you're spending all your time doing. It reminds you that there's a world outside of science, and two, your friends who are outside of science are always going to think what you are doing at school. It's a great way to keep yourself motivated because you get too bogged down in the weeds on a PhD and you lose sight of how interesting the work is.
Dr. Correa, I'm so thrilled with this conversation with you. I love your story, and I wish you continued success as you continue in your career.